The crystal spire had never been so bright. Every light in the great hall burned at full strength, casting rainbow patterns across the walls as the High Council gathered to celebrate their greatest victory. Fleet Commander stood at the center of the room, his four arms raised high as the crowd chanted his name. He had done what no other commander had managed in 300 years of expansion. He had stopped the humans. The cheering grew louder as began to speak. His voice carried through the massive chamber, amplified by ancient crystals embedded in the ceiling. He told the story of the battle in the Nexus corridor, how his fleet had waited in the shadow of a dead moon for the human colony ship to pass. The vessel was called the Endurance, and it carried over 3,000 humans seeking to establish a new home in territory they claimed as their own. Described the moment his ships emerged from hiding, how the human vessel had tried to run but found itself surrounded. The Endurance had no military escort. It was a civilian ship filled with families and farmers and dreamers who thought they could simply take what belonged to the Empire. The council members listened with satisfaction as detailed the destruction. His ships had torn the Endurance apart piece by piece. Some escape pods had launched in the chaos, but his fighters had hunted them down one by one. The sensor logs confirmed complete elimination. No survivors, no witnesses, no humans left to tell the tale or seek revenge. Elder sat in his chair near the back of the hall, and he did not cheer. He was the oldest member of the council, having served for over 2 centuries. His scales had faded to a pale gray, and his eyes had seen too much to share in the excitement of younger. He watched accept praise and medals and promises of wealth, and he felt something cold settle in his stomach. After the ceremony, approached in the corridor outside the Great Hall, the fleet commander was surrounded by admirers, but his age and position gave him the authority to interrupt. He asked a simple question. Had he studied human history before attacking their ship? Laughed at the old elder. He said there was nothing to study. Humans were soft creatures from a small planet on the edge of known space. They had only achieved interstellar travel 2 centuries ago, while they had ruled their corner of the galaxy for thousands of years. Their technology was inferior. Their bodies were fragile. They needed to breathe a specific mixture of gases and could only survive in a narrow range of temperatures. How could such limited beings pose any threat to the mighty empire? Shook his head slowly. He told about the old records, the ones from first contact with humanity 3 generations ago. The scouts who discovered Earth had noted something strange about the third planet in that system. It was a death world. The gravity was crushing compared to most inhabited planets. The atmosphere was corrosive. The surface was covered with predators that hunted and killed without mercy. And yet humans had not merely survived on this nightmare world. They had conquered it. They had spread across every corner of their planet, adapting to frozen wastelands and burning deserts and everything in between. Waved away the concerns. He said the old records were exaggerated. He had seen humans up close through his targeting sensors. They died just like any other species when you hit them with enough firepower. Celebration continued for 3 full days. Every city on Prime held festivals in honor of the victory. The message spread across the empire that the human threat had been eliminated before it could take root. Young signed up for military service in record numbers, inspired by his triumph. The council voted to award him a permanent seat among their ranks, making him the youngest military commander to ever hold such power. On the 7th day after the battle, a young sensor technician named sat alone in a monitoring station on the night side of the planet. His job was boring but necessary. He watched the screens for any sign of approaching ships or debris that might threaten the populated regions below. Most nights, he saw nothing but stars and the occasional meteor burning up in the upper atmosphere. Something caught his attention shortly after midnight. Small objects appeared at the edge of his detection range, entering the atmosphere from an angle that made no sense. They were not coming from any shipping lane or patrol route. They moved slowly, almost drifting, using the planet's own rotation to mask their approach. Counted them as they appeared on his screen. 10, 20, 50, over 100. He reached for the communication panel to report the anomaly, but before his hand touched the controls, the objects vanished from his display. He checked his equipment and found nothing wrong. He ran a diagnostic on the sensors and everything came back normal. The objects were simply gone. Sat back in his chair and thought about what he had seen. The most logical explanation was debris from the destroyed human ship. Perhaps some pieces had drifted for days before being caught in the planet's gravity. That had to be it. There was no other possibility. The humans were dead. Everyone said so. The great fleet commander himself had confirmed the kill. The technician deleted the recording of the anomaly. He did not want to look foolish by reporting debris as a potential threat. He did not want the other technicians to laugh at him for being afraid of dead metal falling from the sky. He made himself a cup of warm liquid and tried to forget what he had seen. Far below the monitoring station, in a dense forest on the dark continent, something hit the ground with a soft thump. Then another, and another. The sounds continued for hours, spread across thousands of kilometers, too quiet and too scattered for anyone to notice. Inside one of the fallen objects, a red light turned green. A seal hissed as pressure equalized. A hatch opened, and a human hand reached out to grip the edge of the opening. Sergeant Grace pulled herself out of the drop pod and took her first breath of alien air. She checked her weapon and then looked up at the stars that had hidden her descent. She smiled in the darkness. The thought they had won. They thought every human from the Endurance was dead. They had thrown their parties and given their speeches and lowered their defenses because the threat was over. They celebrated too soon. Grace activated her communicator and whispered a single word to her team members landing across the planet. The word was simple. It was a beginning. Contact. Grace moved through the forest like a shadow. The trees on this world grew tall and thin, with leaves that glowed faintly in shades of blue and purple. She had trained for years to operate in alien environments, but nothing prepared a soldier completely for the strangeness of another world. The air smelled wrong. The gravity pulled at her body in unfamiliar ways. Every sound made her freeze and listen, because she did not know which creatures here were dangerous and which were harmless. Behind her, 4 other humans followed in perfect silence. Corporal walked second in line, his eyes constantly scanning the darkness for threats. The rest of the team spread out in a protective formation, each member covering a different angle. They had trained together for so long that they no longer needed words to communicate. Hand signals and small gestures were enough. They reached a clearing after 2 hours of walking. Grace checked her equipment and confirmed that 11 other teams had made successful landings across the planet. 230 human operators were now on soil. No casualties, no detection. The first phase of the operation was complete. Set up a small shelter while the others secured the perimeter. Grace sat against a tree and allowed herself a moment to remember how they had arrived here. The memory still hurt, but she needed to hold on to it. She needed to remember why they were fighting. The Endurance had been a beautiful ship. It carried families and children and elderly couples who wanted to spend their final years on a new world. Grace and her team had been assigned as security, a small military presence to protect the colonists from pirates or natural disasters. Nobody expected a full fleet to appear from nowhere and open fire on a civilian vessel. Captain Daniel Perry had made the decision in seconds. The Endurance could not fight and could not run, but it could do one thing. It could die in a way that mattered. Perry ordered all combat personnel into the modified drop pods that were meant for planetary emergencies. He changed their targeting coordinates from the nearest safe world to the itself. Then he pointed the Endurance directly at the largest enemy warship and accelerated to full speed. They destroyed the Endurance before it could hit anything important. They thought they were shooting down a desperate escape attempt. They celebrated their kills as the debris scattered across the void. They never noticed the 240 small pods slipping away in the chaos, using the explosion as cover, riding the shockwave toward the one place no enemy would ever think to look. Grace opened her eyes and pushed the memory aside. Captain Perry had given them a chance. She would not waste it. Morning came slowly on this world. The sun was smaller and redder than the one Grace had grown up under, and it painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. Woke her with a tap on the shoulder. He had news. A local had stumbled into their perimeter during the night. One of the team members had captured her without violence. The alien was young, with pale green scales and wide eyes that showed more confusion than fear. She had been checking animal traps in the forest when she walked straight into a human soldier. Grace approached the prisoner carefully. The female was tied to a tree with soft restraints that would not hurt her. She stared at Grace with an expression that was hard to read on an alien face. Grace had studied language and culture during the long journey on the Endurance, so she knew enough to communicate. The alien said her name was. She was a farmer who lived alone on the edge of the forest. She asked Grace what humans were doing on her world. Everyone knew the humans were dead. The whole empire had celebrated their destruction. Grace smiled at that. She told that rumors of human death were greatly exaggerated. She explained that they were soldiers, not colonists, and that they had come to deliver a message to the people. A message about consequences. Did not understand. She asked what harm a few hundred humans could do against a planet of billions. The military was vast and powerful. They had ships and weapons and armies that could crush any invasion force. The humans had nothing but the gear they carried on their backs. Laughed quietly at that. He told Grace that the alien did not know what she was dealing with. Grace silenced him with a look. She did not want to frighten the prisoner more than necessary. Over the next 2 days, Grace and her team gathered information. They moved through the countryside, avoiding settlements and military patrols. They documented everything they saw: guard schedules, communication towers, power stations, weapons depots. They had relaxed completely since the celebration. Their soldiers walked their posts without alertness. Their sensors operated at minimum power. Their orbital defenses had been reduced to peacetime levels. Grace sent encrypted reports to the other teams. The picture that emerged was exactly what they had hoped for. They believed so completely in their victory that they had made themselves vulnerable. Their arrogance had become their greatest weakness. Watched the humans work with growing unease. She saw how they moved with purpose and precision. She noticed how they never argued or wasted time. She observed the way they communicated without speaking, as if they could read each other's thoughts. These were not desperate survivors scrambling to stay alive. These were predators studying their prey. On the third night, Grace sat beside and shared food with her. The alien ate carefully, still uncertain if she was a prisoner or a guest. Grace asked her about the celebration after the Endurance was destroyed. She wanted to know how they had reacted to killing 3,000 civilians. Lowered her eyes. She admitted that the whole planet had rejoiced. She said that humans were seen as vermin, as pests that needed to be eliminated before they spread too far. Nobody thought about the families on that ship. Nobody considered that humans had feelings or hopes or dreams. They were just targets on a screen. Grace nodded slowly. She thanked for her honesty. Then she walked to the edge of the camp and looked up at the stars. The human fleet was waiting out there, hidden in the darkness beyond the patrol routes. They had been silent since the Endurance died, letting the Empire believe the threat had ended. But they were listening, they were watching, and they were ready. Grace activated her long-range transmitter and sent a single burst of encrypted data. The message contained targeting coordinates, patrol schedules, and defense analysis from all 12 ground teams. At the end of the message, she added 3 simple words. Conditions are favorable. Somewhere in the cold void of space, Admiral Karen Mitchell received the transmission aboard the carrier Unity. She read the message twice. Then she gave the order that would change the galaxy forever. The fleet began to move. Fleet Commander woke to the sound of alarms. He had been dreaming of his victory parade, of crowds chanting his name, of the power and glory that now belonged to him. The shrieking alert cut through the dream like a blade and dragged him back to reality. He stumbled from his bed and demanded a report. His aide rushed in with a tablet displaying emergency notifications from across the planet. Power stations were failing. Communication relays were going dark. Military bases reported explosions and gunfire. Orbital defense platforms had lost contact with ground control. The entire planet seemed to be falling apart at once. Stared at the reports and could not understand what he was seeing. This was impossible. There were no enemies left to fight. He had killed them all himself. He asked who was attacking, and his aide could not answer. Nobody knew. The attackers moved too fast and struck too precisely for anyone to identify them. In the deep forest, Grace led her team toward their primary target. The planetary shield generator sat at the center of a military compound 2 kilometers ahead. Without those shields, they would be exposed to orbital bombardment. Every ground team had a similar objective: 17 critical targets across the planet. 17 strikes happening at the exact same moment. Moved beside Grace, his weapon ready. His face was calm despite the danger ahead. He had been a soldier for 15 years, and he had never felt more focused than he did right now. They had killed his friends on the Endurance. They had murdered children who had never hurt anyone. They had laughed and celebrated while human bodies drifted through the void. Tonight would give them something new to think about. The compound guards never saw the attack coming. Grace and her team moved through the darkness like ghosts, using shadows and silence as their weapons. The soldiers were trained for space combat. They understood ship-to-ship battles and orbital bombardment patterns. They had no experience fighting an enemy that crawled through ventilation shafts and attacked from behind. The first guard fell without making a sound. Then the second. The humans moved from position to position, clearing rooms and corridors with terrifying efficiency. They tried to respond, but their communication systems were already compromised. Their reinforcements could not find the attackers. Their weapons could not track targets that refused to stand still. Took a wound during the assault on the generator room. An officer managed to fire before could reach him, and the energy bolt burned through his left arm. He dropped to one knee but kept fighting. Grace shouted for him to fall back, but he refused. He said the mission was more important than his arm. He said he would rest when the shield generator was destroyed. Across the planet, similar scenes played out at every target. Human teams struck with precision that they could not match. The attackers seemed to know exactly where to go and what to destroy. They avoided civilian areas and focused only on military infrastructure. They moved through buildings that should have been secure, using doors and windows and weaknesses that they never thought to guard. In the command center of the Crystal Spire, Elder confronted as chaos consumed the room. Officers ran back and forth with contradictory reports. Screens showed destruction spreading across every continent. The Great Fleet Commander stood frozen at the center of it all, unable to process what was happening. Grabbed by the arm and demanded answers. He asked how humans could be on the planet when every human from the Endurance was confirmed dead. He asked how a handful of survivors could cause so much damage to the mightiest military force in the sector. He asked why looked so afraid when he had been so confident just days ago. Had no answers. He could only stare at the destruction unfolding on his screens. The power grid was failing. The communication network was collapsing. Defense platforms were going offline one by one. Everything he had built, everything he had achieved was crumbling around him. Grace planted the explosives on the shield generator herself. She set the timer for 2 minutes and ordered her team to move out. They ran through corridors filled with smoke and confusion, stepping over fallen soldiers who had never expected to fight an enemy on their own soil. Stumbled twice but kept moving. His wound was serious, but human bodies were built to endure punishment that would kill most species. They reached the extraction point just as the generator exploded. The blast lit up the night sky and sent a column of fire into the clouds. Across the planet, similar explosions marked the success of other teams. The planetary shield network flickered and died, leaving the naked and vulnerable. Watch the explosion from the forest where Grace had left her. The restraints were gone now. Grace had freed her before the attack, telling her to run home and stay there, but could not move. She stood among the glowing trees and watched fire rise from the military compound, and she finally understood what she was witnessing. These humans were not refugees or colonists or explorers. They were warriors from a death world, creatures who had evolved in an environment so hostile that survival required constant violence. They had come to Prime not to escape or to hide, but to hunt. They had attacked their families and celebrated their deaths, and now the humans were teaching them the cost of that mistake. Grace looked up at the sky as the last echoes of the explosion faded. The stars were visible now, brighter than before without the shield interference. Somewhere up there, the Unity and its battle group were watching. They were waiting for the signal that would begin the next phase of the operation. She raised her communicator and spoke clearly into the night air. Her words would travel across space to reach Admiral Mitchell, and they would seal the fate of the Empire. The door is open, bring them hell. Above the planet, engines ignited, weapons charged, fighters launched from carrier bays. The human fleet emerged from hiding and turned toward the helpless world below. The real battle was about to begin. Admiral Karen Mitchell stood on the bridge of the Unity and watched the planet grow larger on the main display. Prime was a beautiful world, covered with blue oceans and green continents that reminded her of Earth. She wondered briefly if they appreciated the beauty of their home. She wondered if they ever looked up at their sky and felt grateful to be alive. Then she remembered the 3,000 people who died on the Endurance. She remembered the names of the children who burned when weapons tore through the civilian quarters. She remembered the recordings of Fleet Commander laughing as he confirmed the kill. Her sympathy faded, replaced by cold determination. The human fleet numbered 12 warships. It was a small force compared to the vast armada the Empire could assemble. But the ships were scattered across a dozen systems, maintaining control over conquered territories. Only a handful of vessels remained to defend and they were caught completely off guard by the sudden appearance of enemies they believed to be extinct. The first defense station opened fire as the Unity approached. The shots went wide, targeting where the human ship should have been based on predictable approach patterns. But human pilots did not fly predictable paths. They moved in ways that the expectations of species raised on low-gravity worlds. They pulled turns that would crush bodies under the force. They accelerated and stopped with reflexes that alien eyes could barely follow. Mitchell ordered the fighters to clear the orbital platforms. Squadrons of small human craft swarmed the defense stations, slipping between their weapons and striking weak points with surgical precision. The platforms were designed to destroy enemy warships from a distance. They had no answer for dozens of tiny attackers that moved too fast to target. On the surface, watched his orbital defenses crumble. He screamed orders at his officers, demanding that they do something to stop the human advance. But there was nothing to do. The planetary shields were gone. The communication network was destroyed. The remaining defense stations were being picked apart by fighters that danced through space like demons. A young officer approached with a desperate suggestion. He said they should evacuate the cities. He said they should move civilians to shelters before the human bombardment began. The officer expected the worst because that was what they would do in this situation. If their positions were reversed, commanders would already be raining fire on human population centers. But the bombardment never came. Instead, the human ships took up positions in orbit and began launching drop ships, not missiles, not bombs, transport vessels carrying soldiers and equipment. The humans were not here to destroy cities. They were here for something else entirely. Grace saw the dropships descending through the morning sky as her team fought toward the extraction zone. Was fatting, his wound draining strength with every step. 2 other team members supported him between them, keeping him moving despite his protests. Grace had called for medical evacuation, but the dropships had other priorities first. The military was in complete disarray. Soldiers ran through the streets without orders, firing at shadows and each other. Commanders issued contradictory instructions over broken communication channels. The entire structure of planetary defense had collapsed in a single night, brought down by 200 humans who understood that victory came from precision rather than numbers. A squad of soldiers blocked the road ahead. They had set up a barricade and were firing at anything that moved. Grace ordered her team to take cover while she assessed the situation. She could see civilians cowering in buildings nearby, caught between the soldiers and whatever enemy the soldiers thought they were fighting. Pushed himself up against a wall and checked his weapon. He told Grace that he could draw their fire while the team flanked around. He said his arm was useless anyway, so he might as well make himself useful as a distraction. Grace saw the truth in his eyes. He was offering to sacrifice himself so the rest of them could complete the mission. She refused. She told him that no one else was dying today, not her people, not even the civilians who had cheered for their deaths a week ago. She pulled a smoke grenade from her belt and threw it toward the barricade. Then she ran straight at the position. The soldiers could not see her through the thick smoke. They heard her footsteps and fired blindly, but she was already past them before they could adjust. She came out of the smoke behind their line and took down 3 of them before they knew she was there. The rest surrendered when they realized they were outmatched. Grace did not kill the survivors. She took their weapons and pointed toward the shelters where civilians were hiding. She told them in their own language to go protect their families instead of fighting a war they had already lost. The soldiers stared at her with confusion and fear, then ran. Above them, the orbital battle was ending. The last defense station went dark as human boarding parties secured its reactor. Admiral Mitchell transmitted a message across all frequencies, ensuring that every receiver on the planet would hear her words. She introduced herself and explained what was happening. She told them that their military had attacked a civilian vessel without provocation. She told them that 3,000 innocent people had died while their fleet commander celebrated and their citizens cheered. She told them that humanity had come to deliver justice, not extinction. Her voice grew cold as she continued. She said that every military installation on the planet would be destroyed. Every shipyard, every weapons factory, every training facility and research center. The war machine would be dismantled piece by piece until nothing remained. But she made one promise that echoed across the airwaves. Civilian targets would not be touched, homes would stand, schools would remain, hospitals would continue to function. The humans would destroy only the tools of war, leaving the people to rebuild in peace. This was not genocide. This was not revenge. This was a lesson. Elder heard the transmission in the command center and felt something he had not experienced in decades: hope. The humans were angry, and they had every right to be. But they were not monsters. They were not the savage beasts that propaganda had described for generations. They had the power to burn every city on the planet, and instead they chose to show mercy. He looked at who stood frozen before the screens showing destruction spreading across the military districts. The great fleet commander who had laughed at the deaths of human children now watched his legacy crumble, and he finally understood what Elder had tried to warn him about. Humans did not forget. They did not forgive easily, but they also did not become what they fought against. They held on to something that made them different from other species in the galaxy, something that made them terrifying and admirable at the same time. They held onto their humanity. 3 weeks had passed since the human fleet descended upon Prime. The fires were out now, but smoke still rose from the ruins of military installations across the planet. Citizens walked through streets that had been untouched by the destruction, staring at the sky with new eyes. The humans had kept their promise. Every weapon was gone, but every home still stood. Grace returned to the planet as part of the occupation force. She had spent 2 weeks on the Unity recovering from minor injuries and debriefing with military intelligence. Was still in the medical bay, his arm slowly healing with the help of human medicine. He would fight again someday, but for now, he needed rest. She requested permission to visit the forest where her team had landed on the first night. The request was granted without question. Admiral Mitchell understood that soldiers needed closure after difficult missions. She understood that Grace had unfinished business on the surface. The transport dropped her at the edge of the dense woodland where everything had begun. The blue and purple leaves still glowed faintly in the shadows, creating an alien beauty that Grace had not appreciated during the operation. She walked the familiar path toward the farm where lived, remembering every step of her journey 3 weeks ago. The farmhouse was small but well-maintained. Was outside when Grace arrived, working in a field of strange vegetables that grew in spiraling patterns. She looked up at the sound of approaching footsteps and froze when she recognized the human soldier. Grace raised her hands to show she meant no harm. She said she came only to talk, not to fight. Hesitated for a long moment, then set down her tools and walked toward the visitor. They sat together on a stone wall that bordered the field. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded Grace of home. She asked how she was doing. They admitted that things had been difficult. Many of her neighbors blamed her for not warning them about the human presence. Others feared her because she had spoken with the enemy and survived. Grace apologized for putting her in that position. She said she had no choice but to take prisoner that night. Leaving a witness free would have endangered the entire operation, but she never intended to hurt her. She never intended to hurt any civilian. Asked a question that had been burning inside her since the night she watched the shield generator explode. She asked why the humans had spared the cities. She asked why they had shown mercy to people who celebrated the murder of human families. She did not understand how such restraint was possible. Grace thought carefully before answering. She said that humanity had a long and bloody history. Humans had fought wars among themselves for thousands of years before they ever reached the stars. They had committed terrible crimes against each other in the name of revenge and justice and fear. But they had also learned painful lessons from those crimes. They had learned that destruction without purpose only created more enemies. They had learned that true strength came from knowing when not to use power. She told about the endurance. She described the families who lived aboard that ship, the children who played in the corridors, the elderly couples who held hands while watching stars pass by the windows. She explained that those people wanted nothing more than a new home where they could live in peace. They killed them for daring to exist in the wrong part of space. Humans could have responded by burning Prime to ash. They had the weapons and the anger to do it. But they chose a different path. They destroyed the machines of war while leaving the people alive. They sent a message to the galaxy that humanity would not be victimized, but neither would they become the villains of someone else's story. Lowered her eyes. She admitted that her people had been taught to see humans as vermin, as a disease that needed to be wiped out before it spread. She had believed those teachings until the night she watched Grace and her team operate. She saw how they risked their own lives to avoid hurting civilians. She saw the humanity in beings she had been raised to hate. The trial of Fleet Commander began the following month. A human prosecutor named Park presented evidence of war crimes to a tribunal that included representatives from 12 species. Offered no defense. He sat in silence as recordings played of his orders to destroy the Endurance and his laughter as escape pods were eliminated. Asked a single question at the end of the proceedings. He asked why they expected no consequences for their actions. He asked why they thought they could murder 3,000 civilians and celebrate without reprisal. Finally spoke. He said they had always been the strongest species in their region of space. They had conquered dozens of worlds and subjugated countless populations. No one had ever challenged them before. No one had ever made them pay for their crimes. He admitted that arrogance had blinded him to the threat humans posed. He admitted that he had underestimated a species he knew nothing about. Nodded slowly. He said that arrogance was the most dangerous weakness of all. He said that they had celebrated too soon, and now they would spend generations rebuilding what they had lost. 6 months after the attack, a memorial was built on Prime. Human engineers constructed it from native stone, creating a simple monument that listed the names of everyone who died on the Endurance. The names covered 4 walls, arranged in neat rows that seemed to go on forever. Visitors from many species came to pay their respects. Some left flowers, some left written apologies, some simply stood in silence and read the names. Came to the memorial on a cold morning when few others were present. She walked slowly along the walls, reading names she could not pronounce, imagining the lives that had been lost. She stopped at the name of a child who had been only 6 years old when the attack came. She placed a small flower at the base of the wall and whispered an apology that no one would ever hear. Grace found her there an hour later. The human soldier had been visiting the memorial regularly, keeping watch over the site like a guardian. She recognized immediately and walked over to stand beside her. Neither spoke for a long time. They simply stood together, a human and a looking at the names of the dead. Finally, asked if there could ever be peace between their peoples. She asked if forgiveness was possible after so much pain. Grace considered the question carefully. She said that forgiveness was never easy. She said that the families of the dead would carry their grief forever. But she also said that holding onto hatred would only lead to more death. Humanity had learned that lesson through centuries of blood and suffering. She looked at and saw not an enemy but a person. A farmer who had been caught up in events beyond her control. A member of a species that had done terrible things but was not beyond redemption. Forgiveness takes time, Grace said, but we are willing to try. That is what makes us human. Nodded slowly. She looked back at the memorial, at the thousands of names carved into stone, at the flowers left by visitors who wanted to make amends. She understood now that humanity would never forget what happened to the Endurance, but they were willing to move forward. They were willing to build something new from the ashes of the old. The sun rose higher over Prime, warming a world that was learning to see its former enemies in a new light. The Empire had fallen. The humans had delivered their justice. And somewhere in the space between revenge and mercy, a fragile hope began to grow. The celebration was over. The real work was just beginning.